Hello. In my series on building better worlds, today I'll be talking about the first chapter of the book, which is also the introduction of the book. So, primarily, the way I'm going to handle discussing this book is to share with you my understanding and grasp of what the authors are trying to do. But please do bear in mind that this is just my limited understanding of the book, and I do encourage you to read it and then discuss it amongst yourselves. The best way to do that would be if you formed a discussion group and also interact with these conversations so that I can learn from you and I can also further understand the book. So here we go, Chapter 1 of Building Better Worlds. So the introduction has two parts. Part 1 from liberal bystanding to emancipatory praxis, and Part 2 about positionality of the authors and what they are hoping to accomplish, and also an introduction to the chapter structure. So the way I read the introduction is I read Part 1 as an explanation of the philosophical and theoretical lineage of the book. This is the part in which the authors share with us what strains of liberatory and emancipatory philosophy and practice are they drawing on. And then in Part 2, they share with us their own politics and positionality. And then the Zapatista movement kind of becomes an analog towards which we look and they look to draw lessons, not idealized or romanticized lessons, but lessons from a living, breathing movement of indigenous people fighting for their rights within the regime of neoliberal capital, within the boundaries of a nation state, but also within the global economic system and the global politics. So that's how I'm going to tackle the introduction. First Part 1, and then a little bit about the Part 2 and plan of the book. So in a way, the very first lines of the introduction declare quite clearly the project or the mission of the book itself. And I quote, "Before we get started, and in order to be as upfront as possible about things, we must confess that this book is actually not about Zapatistas, believe it or not, but rather about political education. That said, what better example of political education than the Zapatistas?" So this very first declaration, so to speak, basically clearly emphasizes that the main project of the book is to encourage what the authors are calling political education. Obviously, they didn't come up with the term, it's not something new, but that is what is the mission of the book. And in 21st century, within the neoliberal capital regime, if we need something actually existent in the world that can teach us about the praxis of politics in opposition to the instrumental logic of neoliberal capitalism, if we need an analog, a living, breathing group of people connected to a territory, fighting against almost all the ills of neoliberalism, then the Zapatistas, of course, are a great example. But what the authors are telling us, in my opinion, in the very outset, is that they are not giving us yet another introduction to the Zapatista movement, but rather teaching us how to impart political education, how to engage in political education as informed by the Zapatista movement itself. And then they set up a compound question for their project, which I think is really important. What is it? Here is the question that the authors are reflecting on and want us to reflect on. Under what circumstances is continuing to live under such conditions our best option, and why are we accepting it? The conditions that they are talking about are the ecological disaster happening in the world, the wars, the famines, the poverty, the exclusion of the native people, all the ills that are a byproduct of neoliberal capitalistic system. These are the conditions in which we live. The world in great peril, environmentally, politically, and in terms of human existence. Vast numbers of people on this planet live in poverty, whose lives are impacted by policies that they had no say in the making. This is the world, and then the question, why do we accept to live in it, and what can we do about it? So in a way then, if I were to conclude this first opening of the book is telling us we are here to share with you ideas about what is political education and why is it important. Here is what the state of the world is right now in front of our eyes. We can all see it, experience it, know about it. And then the question is, do I accept the world as it is? Or do I try to change it? And if I try to change it, the tools that I would need will come from a political education. And if I need an example of a group of people having successfully tried not just the educational aspects of political education, but actual practice of it, we're going to draw some inspiration from the Zapatistas. So that's what I get from the first initial lines of the introduction. So as I mentioned earlier, the introduction has two major parts, part 1 and part 2. Now, part 1 is where they basically let us know that they are here to promote political education as a way to create liberatory practice, right? And the subsections are surviving society and the present moment, liberal bystanding versus radical collective action, the costs and consequences of liberal bystanding. So that's an important part of the introduction, and I'll talk briefly about it. The part 2, as I mentioned earlier, is where the authors explain their own positionality, but also what do they want to accomplish by this book? What is their hope? What are their aspirations? And then how are they engaging with the Zapatista materials, but also with the Zapatista movement? What degree of respect is accorded to the Zapatistas without being hagiographic? But it kind of shares their sensitivity to this idea that they are using this praxis and knowledge developed, produced, and practiced by the Zapatistas, but with their consent. So that's really crucial. And then towards the end of the introduction, they basically let us know how the chapters are arranged and why. Obviously, I don't need to explain that part, but I'll dwell on part 1 and then briefly move into part 2 of the introduction. In the very beginning of the first part of the introduction, the authors give us a sort of a genealogy of philosophy and philosophical and theoretical works that they are drawing from that are connected to political education, but also that merge well or in a way gel well with the Zapatista praxis and philosophy. So let's talk about these people, these scholars, and this sort of a genealogy of their philosophical retrieval that they are mobilizing for this book. So in the first major part of the introduction, the authors start with Frantz Fanon. Actually, specific passages from the very end of his book, The Wretched of the Earth. And this is a really crucial quote from Fanon. Let us not pay tribute to Europe by creating state institutions and societies that draw their inspiration from it. Humanity expects other things from us than this grotesque and generally obscene emulation. For Europe, for ourselves, and for humanity, comrades, we must make a new start. Develop new ways of thinking and endeavor to create a new humanity. Now, I have a different translation of The Wretched of the Earth, but this passage or these passages are pretty much the end of the book. Now, Wretched of the Earth is Fanon's deeply revolutionary work. In this book, there is also his speech about nationalism. In that speech and the essay, Fanon traces 3 stages of African nationalism, or nationalism as it emerges in the colonial situations. The first phase for authors, writers, and philosophers is where they emulate the styles of their masters. And the height of accomplishment is if they can write like their colonial masters. In the second stage, Fanon suggests that the natives, the native speakers, the native writers, the artists recover and rediscover their own heritage and start creating their works of art built on that. And in the third and final stage is when they join the revolution for freedom, for decolonization. And that is where that beautiful sentence that Fanon writes, that they speak the heart of the people. So bear in mind that Fanon of The Wretched of the Earth, especially in that speech and essay, is pushing against the Pan-African assumptions of the negritude movement. But Fanon is saying, isn't that nationalism is the ultimate aim of decolonial struggles. But what he's saying is that we first must create viable nations and then work towards a Pan-Africanist movement. So nationalism or nation states for him are a step towards creating a different kind of humanity. So in a way, at the end of his book, Fanon is ultimately giving us a message about decoloniality itself. That we can only decolonize ourselves and our politics if we also stop blindly emulating what has been offered to us by Europe and now by America. And part of it is that it's a destructive system. Right? So we must create something new. So that's where the authors start, right? Because when we go to the Zapatistas, we realize that that is exactly what the Zapatista movement is doing, relying on native knowledges, building lateral solidarities, constantly learning from each other, but in opposition to the destructive mandates of neoliberal capital. Right? Then the authors take us to the next person that has influenced them and who was influenced by Fanon, and that is, of course, Paulo Freire. So that means if they are talking about political education and trying to lead us to political emancipation, right, or emancipatory praxis, they must have read their Freire, right? So Freire is the next author that brings in the critical pedagogy strain of education for us, right? And then they go to radical feminists, Marxist radical feminists. So we have Silvia Federici, right? Her famous work, Caliban and the Witch, right? And I think they're also drawing from Martha Gimenez's work, Social Production of Capital, right? That's her major work. So what do these intersectionist feminists bring? What was Federici's main insight? That at the instant the proletariat is created, right, through the rise of capital, women are inscribed in the domestic sphere because the place of work, the place of production becomes dominantly male. I mean, that's her insight. That's what her research is about. Now, Gimenez obviously is telling us that there is always social production happening in a capitalistic society, but behind the obvious of the social production of capital, there is the domesticated labor of the women. So we are getting Fanon, early decolonial thought of Fanon, right? But his lost world, so to speak, from Wretched of the Earth. We're getting insights from Paulo Freire, right? And then we're getting insights from radical intersectionalist Marxist feminists, right? And then they also take us to one of the most important podcasts in the UK, which is being followed by everyone, and that is Surviving Society. We get a quote from the producers. What does it say? It's been such a difficult year. We aren't going to use this message to spell out how challenging it has been. So obviously they're talking about the year, I think, of the pandemic. For us, whatever the solutions, love, care, and understanding will always form the basis of any action. Surviving Society remains committed to engaging critically with experts, activists, and writers who are involved in seeking solutions to the issues of the day. A key theme for us going into 2021 is solidarity. We feel that together we can achieve more through collective action. Collective action lies the possibility of building a future for everyone. Now, after giving us this lineage, this kind of parameters of the thought and philosophies and activism that they are drawing from, they also briefly tell us in this section of the introduction that just 20 years after Fanon dies, Zapatistas rise on the very day that NAFTA is implemented and burst onto the scene to fight for the rights of the Mayan people, the native people of Mexico, right? Against maybe the greatest moment of neoliberal capital, the initiation of NAFTA, and that they, in a way, are inhabiting all these strains that the writers have just introduced us to, and as we read the book, it will become pretty obvious to us. I'm not saying that the Zapatistas went and read these books, but that what we learn from these books, so much of it, the collaboration, the solidarity, the egalitarianism, the rights of the women, women in leadership roles, the care for the environment, and the decolonial struggle to fight against the dictates of neoliberal capital. These are the things that we have read in the books. These are the things that the Zapatistas struggle with and have tried to figure out ways of challenging these powerful forces of the world. And that probably is something that we can learn from it. The next section of the introduction is really crucial because it is about liberal bystanding and its consequences. So let's talk a little about that. So the next two subsections of part 1 of the introduction are about liberal bystanding. Now, my rough understanding of liberal bystanding is any liberal positionality which is reformative, where people just focus on being nice, not rocking the boat, the kind of liberal people that you encounter in universities and elsewhere who are afraid of challenging authority. Now, the authors cite Mary Watkins and Helen Schulman's work, right? And I highly recommend that you read it. But they also point out certain attributes that are always visible in people who are liberal bystanders. That means that as long as their self-interest is served, they would not do anything to transform the society or to change anything. So they tend to be very self-centered. So in my view, a liberal bystander subjectivity is produced through the current educational system in which students are taught to learn the system, to learn how to compete, how to safeguard their own interest, with almost a total disregard of the consequences of their actions on the other. That's the kind of liberal bystanding that they are talking about. And it has two costs. One, to the individuals themselves, because they never are really happy. I mean, if you look at the statistics in the developed countries right now, the instances of anxiety and depressions are at the highest level, and part of it is this isolated, self-centered, bystanding way of life. Franco Berardi actually has a great explanation of it in his book, Soul at Work. I have some lectures on it. Please do watch them. Against liberal bystanding, which also has social consequences, right? There are personal consequences, but then there are social consequences, because the social cost is equally, if not more, pernicious, in particular because of who are being abandoned and forgotten by liberal bystanders. So if you're self-centered, or if you're only interested in your own political interest, you will forget about whose lives are being destroyed. Let me give you a clear example from the contemporary moment. Right now, you and I know that people in Gaza are being destroyed. They are being starved and killed by the Israeli armed forces. It's a fact. We have statistics, we have the numbers, we have the stories. But any time I have tried to criticize President Biden and his weakness on this issue, or his apathy, the so-called liberals have attacked me because it rocks the boat, it makes their candidate weak in the general election. That is a classic example of liberal bystanding, because these people believe that we still need to elect the very president under whose watch lives are being destroyed. People are being starved, right? So against that, the authors then offer radical emancipatory praxis, an education that encourages our students to think the world, to think about their own lives critically, and to work in solidarity with others and not just think for themselves. Of course, that also comes from Paulo Freire, but also the way the Zapatistas learn about the world, teach it to each other, and then constantly keep relearning as their movement progresses, as their struggle goes on. So we have the theoretical strains, and we have not the example, but a place to look for, and that is the Zapatista movement itself. Now, there is a moment here where the authors tell us that they use the term radical And I think the sense in which they are using it is pretty clear, but I have a video on how Paulo Freire defines the term radical, and here is a snippet from that video. A radical for Freire, and he explains certain things, what attributes the radical must have. But the main definition of it, which he describes on page 39 of his book, is that the radical committed to human liberation does not become the prisoner of a circle of truth within which reality is also imprisoned. On the contrary, the more radical the person is, the more fully he or she enters into reality, so that knowing it better, he or she can better transform it. So what is that circle of reality or circle of certainty? That is believing either in the rightist sectarianist way that whatever happens in the present is determined by a past and that must be defended at all costs. And the present can always be defined by a past. So that's the circle of certainty, because people have religious reasons or political reasons to believe in it. The other circle of certainty on the left is this idea that history is on this inexorable march in which we are just the pawns, and if we just wait it out and don't do anything, eventually history will resolve itself. That's a very fatalistic view of history. And that both these constituencies believe in that circle of certainty, right? That to them is true. But a radical person doesn't believe in that. A radical person believes that history and the present can be changed, and that change will come through praxis, and that anyone who wants to change the world must commit to that change and must commit to a liberatory practice. But then Freire also further kind of hones this argument by exactly pinpointing and explaining and enumerating some of the characteristics of this radical person. And those are that a radical person is not afraid to confront, to listen, and to see the world unveiled. Okay, so that basically means that it has to be a critical person, a person who can think the world critically and is not afraid of confronting power or anyone who offers another version of reality, and is constantly seeking to question the reality as it is represented to us. Then a radical person is not afraid to meet the people or to enter into dialogue with them, and that's crucial. If you are radical, your mission, your praxis must be connected to the people. And the people here are the wretched of the earth, are the oppressed, are the poor, are the peasants, the workers. So a radical person thinks critically of the world, believes can be transformed, and then works along with the people who are oppressed, to change it. But at the very same time, this person does not consider him or herself an expert, don't consider themselves as more knowledgeable about history or having the right to speak on behalf of the people. No, these people enter this arena with humility along with the people, and then work with them, learn from them, and share their own knowledge with them. But at no point can this radical person have this top-down view of the very people with whom he or she is working. And so, but they do commit themselves to the cause of that. So this brief introduction to radicalism or being radical coming from Freire, if you go and read that particular part of the book, it becomes deeply clear to me, and probably to you as well, that being radical isn't being fanatical, right, or being extreme in our views, but being someone who thinks critically about the world, tries to transform it in solidarity with others, but with a certain degree of humility and in dialogue with the people, especially the people who are oppressed. Now, this is where I conclude my conversation about part 1 of the introduction. Part 2 of the introduction is also interesting because that's where the authors tell us about what their mission is, Of course, it is political education, right? That we have already been told. But they also tell us on page 13, our primary goal with the book, thus, is to prompt inspiration and hope in readers by raising awareness about the revolutionary politics and emancipatory praxis of the Zapatistas. Now, this is what I think makes this book inspiring. I mean, we have read a lot of books about how to do critical pedagogy, but this is a book that respectfully shares with us philosophical and critical knowledges, has a mission to encourage us to get engaged in political and emancipatory education. But then the authors also learn from the Zapatista movement and want us to learn alongside them. But they are very careful, right? When you read this part of the introduction, you will know that they understand that the Zapatistas are a human movement. They are not infallible. They are not perfect. Actually, the Zapatistas themselves would not call themselves perfect because their struggle is a process, right? They are also very careful in informing us that they are not appropriating the Zapatista knowledge, nor are they performing a Eurocentric clinical study of the Zapatistas. What they share with us in the book about the Zapatista practices is either something that the Zapatistas have themselves made available to the world or something that they allowed our authors to use. Another important thing about positionality of all the authors is that they are all first-generation college scholars, college graduates. They share that class history, right? They come from different backgrounds. Some are European, some are from the Caribbean, some of them are Muslims, right? Some of them are natives. But what they share in common is this positionality of being from a class of people who are either working poor or have been poor and who are first-generation intellectuals. Okay? But another thing, they all in one way or the other have also been in contact with the Zapatistas. They have visited them, they have camped with them, they have attended by the invitation of the Zapatistas their conferences. So they have grounded understanding, so to speak, of Zapatista practices. But they are very careful in telling us, right, that they are not experts on the Zapatista movement and they are not trying to explain the Zapatista movement to their readers, but rather to inspire the readers to explore the movement, to read this book, to explore the movement, and then see how they all can be Zapatistas wherever they are. That's one important mission of the book as laid out in part 2 of the introduction. And then another important thing that is mentioned on page 15. The book is not meant to be comprehensive of anything, but rather provoke curiosity, encourage critical thinking, foster structural analysis, and hopefully inspire readers to explore, discover, and maybe even rebel and rage against the machine more, in addition to refusing to be liberal bystanders. I mean, I find that sentence really inspirational and a bit funny too, right? I love the kind of writing where the authors are telling us, hey, look, we don't have all the answers. We are not experts. We come to you with our words and these experiences in humility. Would you journey with us? Let's read the book together, but let's together learn whatever we can from the Zapatista movement, from the Zapatistas, and then become radical in the Freirean sense, where we want to change this world, right? Make it more just, egalitarian, less destructive, where we care about the planet. These are all the values that the Zapatistas practice, right? And fight against greed, be more dialogic, loving, and share the resources of this planet with each other. So that roughly is my understanding of the introduction. I hope this is useful to you. I do hope you read the book, and if you do, please share your thoughts with me. Please share your thoughts about what I've just offered you as an offering and tell me what you think. I will continue to read the book and offer you, my thoughts, whatever they are worth. Let me know what you think about it. I'm deeply grateful for your time. Thank you so much. Stay safe. Take care of each other. Be a Zapatista wherever you are, and I will now see you next time. Until then, as always, peace and love.